The stepmother's horrible sexual habits made her husband's sons sleep with her, and then she got pregnant. In 1885, this nightmare happened in a cabin in West Virginia that was far away from everything else. Abigail Stroud seemed like the perfect Christian wife, devoted, kind, and religious. But behind the door of her cabin, she kept her teenage stepsons, Caleb and Thomas, in hell on earth. She told the most twisted lie of all when her belly started to grow. She said the baby belonged to the boys. Martha Pringle, the neighbor, saw something so horrible that it made her shake. She ran to Eliza Gable, a herbalist, and begged her to help. But when Eliza tried to tell the awful truth, everyone in the mountain community turned against her. They said she was jealous, angry, and a liar. The sheriff wouldn't listen. The pastor told people to be quiet. How can a whole town choose to protect a monster instead of two boys who can't do anything? And what finally made them stop being ashamed? The frost had barely melted from the cabin steps when Martha Pringle came through the morning mist, her usually clean shawl askew and her breath coming in sharp, visible puffs. Eliza Gable was picking the last of the autumn sage from her herb garden when she looked up and knew something was very wrong. She had lived in these West Virginia mountains for 62 years, but she had never seen Martha Pringle, who could pick apart a neighbor's moral failings with surgical precision during Sunday service, look so completely out of sorts. "Eliza," Martha gasped, gripping the porch rail with white knuckles. "Sweet, merciful Jesus, I've seen something that isn't natural, something that isn't right in the eyes of the Lord." Eliza put down her basket and wiped her hands on her apron as she looked at Martha's pale face. People knew her for making big deals out of small things and saying things in a dramatic way, but this was different. This was the look of someone who had seen hell. "Come in, Martha. Sit down," Eliza said as she led the shaking woman into her small kitchen. The smell of chamomile and willow bark and the sight of dried herbs hanging from the rafters made it a peaceful place. She poured hot tea from the pot she kept on the wood stove and gave it to Martha, who was shaking. "Now tell me what's making you so upset." Martha's voice got so low that it was almost a whisper. "It was this morning, just after dawn. I was outside gathering eggs when I heard strange noises coming from the Stroud place. Not normal noises, Eliza, but noises that made my blood run cold." She stopped to drink her tea, as if to gather her strength. "I crept closer to their cabin and through that crack in their bedroom wall. You know, the one where the chinkings come loose, I saw." Her voice broke completely. "What did you see, Martha?" "Abigail Stroud, that holy woman who leads the church ladies' prayer circle. She was with Caleb. That boy can't be more than 17. "And it wasn't motherly comfort, Eliza, it was." Martha's face crumpled. "It was sinful and wrong. She had that boy doing things that would make the devil cry." Eliza felt a cold stone settle in her stomach. She had given birth to both of those Stroud boys and had watched them grow from bright-eyed kids into the hollow-faced young men they are now that Abigail married their father 3 years ago. She had seen things. How they flinched when their stepmother touched them. How they looked haunted, and how they had stopped talking and become quiet. But she told herself that it was just sadness over losing their mother and getting used to a new family structure. Martha's words helped her understand the fear that had been building up in her chest. "Are you sure you saw what you saw?" "Just as sure as I am that Christ died for our sins." Martha's voice grew stronger as she became more and more angry. "And there's more, Eliza. I've been keeping a closer eye on that house since then, and I've seen her with the younger boy, Thomas, who is only 15. That woman is running a house of sin right under our noses, and the whole community thinks she's a saint." Eliza carefully put down her own teacup. As the mountain's unofficial midwife and herb woman for decades, she had seen the dark side of family secrets. She had helped women who were beaten by their husbands on Sundays, delivered babies whose fathers were unknown, and kept quiet about things that would ruin lives if they were spoken about. But this was not the same. These were kids. "I need to see for myself," she said in a low voice. "Eliza, you can't just march over there and accuse her. That woman has the whole town fooled. They think God himself has blessed her for taking care of those boys without mothers." Eliza was already on her way, though. She was getting her leather satchel and filling it with bottles of tinctures and dried herbs. "I'll go as the herb woman. Tell her I'm bringing things to help her." "What condition?" Eliza's voice was serious when she said, "The one Martha Pringle just told me about." But she doesn't know it yet. She doesn't get that glow and fullness in her face unless she's pregnant. If what you're telling me is true, we need to know whose child it is. It took 20 minutes to walk to the Stroud home through the pine-scented mountain air, but it felt like forever. Eliza's mind was racing with ideas, and each one was worse than the last. She had known Silas Stroud since they were kids. He used to be a good man, but after his wife died, grief and whiskey took away his strength. But sometimes good men couldn't see evil when it had a pretty face and made their food. The Stroud cabin was in a clearing surrounded by tall pines, and smoke was slowly rising from the chimney. It looked calm, even perfect. Eliza knocked on the door with her healer's bag heavy on her shoulder. Abigail Stroud smiled in a way that could have won over angels. She was a pretty woman in her 30s, with golden hair neatly pinned up under a white cap and eyes that looked like the summer sky. Her dress was simple, her manner was nice, and her voice was sweet as honey. "Eliza Gable, what brings you to our humble home?" "Dear, I brought some medicine. I heard you might not be feeling well." Eliza looked at Abigail's face and saw that her cheeks were slightly rounder and her waist was slightly thicker. "Women like you often need extra care." For a brief moment, something flickered behind those blue eyes before the sweet smile came back. "How kind of you. Please come in." The cabin was warm and clean, but the air felt heavy, like it did before a storm. Silas Stroud was slumped in a chair by the fire with a half-empty bottle next to him. His eyes were unfocused and far away. The two boys were sitting at the kitchen table, supposedly eating breakfast, but Eliza could tell they were just moving food around on their plates. "Hey, boys," Abigail said sweetly. "Say hello to Miss Gable." They looked up with eyes that seemed to have been around for a long time. Caleb, the older one, was able to nod. Thomas, who was only 15 and thin as a reed, couldn't seem to look her in the eye at all. "How are you boys doing?" Eliza asked softly. "Everything is going great," Abigail said before either of them could say anything. "Such good boys. They help out around the house and are so devoted to their family." Eliza's skin crawled when she heard the word devoted. She carefully watched the boys' faces and saw it. The little flinch, the way their shoulders tensed, and the flash of something that looked like fear. At that moment, Martha Pringle's terrible story became the truth. Eliza stayed for 20 minutes, talking softly and giving advice on how to deal with morning sickness. Meanwhile, her trained eye was taking notes on the evidence. Abigail's body showed all the signs of being pregnant, maybe 4 months along. The boys moved like they were being whipped, trying not to draw attention to themselves. Silas stayed lost in his bottle, completely unaware of the terrible things happening in his own house. Eliza walked back through the woods on the mountain with heavy feet and a heart full of rage when she finally left. She'd seen evil before, but never with such a perfect mask of piety, and never aimed at kids who had nowhere to go and no one to protect them. That night, as the darkness fell over the mountains like a shroud, Eliza sat on her porch and looked at the distant light from the Stroud cabin. 2 boys were stuck in a nightmare in that house, and no one in the community would ever believe it. A woman with a sweet smile and strong Christian faith protected them. As the first stars came out, she couldn't stop thinking about what to do. She knew she had to do something. The question was whether anyone would listen when she tried to pull back the curtain of respectability and show the monster underneath in a community that valued peace over truth and reputation over justice. If she said things like that, people would either see her as a hero or a pariah. She was afraid she already knew what it would be. The next morning, a cold wind shook the windows of Eliza's cabin and seemed to whisper warnings through the bare branches. She knew she couldn't handle the weight of what she'd seen on her own, but her first attempts to share the burden were harder than she thought they would be. When she talked to Sarah Miller after church about her worries about the Stroud boys in a calm, measured way, Sarah's face hardened like the ground in winter. Sarah said, "Eliza Gable, I'm surprised at you," as she moved her shawl around in a sharp, disapproving way, talking badly about that kind woman who has taken on so much. Those boys were wild before Abigail came along. and now they are quiet, respectful, and God-fearing young men. But Sarah, you know how they react when Sarah's voice sounded like a church door slamming shut when she said, "I've only seen a devoted stepmother raising motherless children. Maybe you should mind your own business instead of getting involved in other people's. You're a single woman with no kids of your own, so it's only natural that you might not understand how families work." The words hurt like a slap, but they were nothing compared to what came next. Within days, whispers began following Eliza through the town. When she walked into the general store, everyone stopped talking. Women turned their backs at the post office. Even Martha Pringle, who had started the whole nightmare with her revelations, began to pull away when she saw how the community reacted. "Maybe I was wrong about what I saw," Martha said when Eliza caught up with her outside the church. "The light wasn't very good, and I'm getting older. It could have been anything." "You were sure, Martha," you said. Martha's eyes darted nervously around the churchyard. "I said a lot of things in the heat of the moment, but Abigail Stroud has been nothing but nice to me since then. She brought me soup when I was sick last week. What a Christian spirit. Maybe we should just let sleeping dogs lie." Eliza became more and more horrified as she realized that the community's need to believe in Abigail's goodness was stronger than their willingness to face the truth. The woman had become so deeply ingrained in their moral world that questioning her was like questioning their own faith, judgment, and ability to see evil when it was right in front of them. Eliza was desperate and felt more and more alone, so she started watching the Stroud property from the woods, hoping to find a chance to talk to one of the boys alone. She saw Thomas gathering firewood near the creek that marked the border between the Stroud land and the forest on a gray afternoon. He was by himself, and his thin body was bent over the weight of split logs. His movements were stiff and lifeless. "Thomas," she said softly, as she came out from behind a group of birch trees. The boy turned around so quickly that he dropped half of what he was carrying. His eyes were wide with a kind of fear she had seen in animals that had been hurt. For a second, she thought he might run away, but something about how she was being nice to him seemed to keep him there. "Don't worry, son. I just want to talk. I can't. She doesn't like it when we talk to people without her knowing." His voice was barely above a whisper, and it sounded like he was going through a lot of stress and something much worse. "She's not here right now. It's just us." Eliza moved slowly, like she would if she were going to calm down a scared horse. "Thomas, I know something is wrong in that house. I know you're in pain." The boy's calmness fell apart like a dam breaking. His shoulders shook, and tears that looked like they'd been held back for years started to fall down his face. "You don't get it. No one can know. No one will ever know. Do you know what, son?" It sounded like he was drowning, and finally found air when he spoke. "It started when I was 13, right after she married Papa. She said it was natural, that she was teaching us to be men. Said it was what mothers did for their sons when fathers couldn't be bothered." Thomas wiped his nose on his sleeve, his young face twisted with shame and confusion. "At first, Caleb tried to stop her, but she has ways of making you do things. And Papa, he's always drunk now, always sleeping, or gone to town. She said that if we ever told anyone, she'd say we forced ourselves on her, that we were animals who couldn't control ourselves." Eliza's heart broke as she realized how terrible things really were. "The baby she has, she says it's ours, mine and Caleb's. She says we can't ever tell because then everyone would know what we are and what we've done." Thomas's voice got so quiet that she could barely hear it. "But we didn't want to." "We never wanted to. She made us." The boy's words hung in the cold air like a curse, and Eliza knew with perfect clarity that this was much worse than what Martha had seen. This was planned, systematic abuse that had been going on for years, hidden behind closed doors, and protected by the community's willful ignorance. "Thomas, this isn't your fault. None of it. What she's doing is wrong, and you and your brother are victims, not participants." "But who would believe us? The whole town thinks she's a saint, and we've been doing these things. Even if we were forced to do them, even if we hated every second, we still did them. Who's going to see us as anything but sinners now?" With Thomas's damning testimony in hand, Eliza marched straight to Sheriff Brody's office, her righteous anger burning like a forge fire. She saw him sitting at his desk with his feet up, reading a newspaper, and picking his teeth with a piece of wood. "Officer, I need to tell you about a crime. A horrible crime against the Stroud boys." Brody looked up with the tired look of a man who had seen it all in a small town. "What kind of crime, Miss Gable?" She laid out everything. What Martha had seen, what she thought, and most importantly, what Thomas had said. She spoke clearly and in a logical way, like she was giving evidence in a court case. But as she spoke, she saw Brody's face go from mild interest to doubt to outright disbelief. "Wait a minute, Miss Gable. You're talking about Abigail Stroud. She's a pillar of our community. She teaches Sunday school, cares for the sick, and never misses a prayer meeting. And you're saying she's doing what you say she's doing, with boys who aren't even related to her? This is what those boys told me, and what I saw with my own eyes. What you think you've seen, and what two confused boys might have said when a woman with her own agenda pushed them." Brody leaned back in his chair and spoke in a condescending tone. "Eliza, I know you mean well, but this is family business. Silas Stroud is a good man, and if there were problems in his house, he'd take care of them. These boys have been through a lot, losing their mother and getting used to a new family situation. Sometimes grief and confusion can make young minds come up with all kinds of stories. So you're not going to look into it? What do you want to find out? Gossip? Rumors? The word of a single woman against a well-respected Christian woman?" Brody's voice got harder. "Please stop this nonsense before it gets out of hand. People around here don't like troublemakers, especially ones who try to ruin good people's reputations with wild stories." Eliza finally understood the full extent of what she was fighting when she left that office. It wasn't just Abigail Stroud who was evil. It was a whole system set up to protect the comfortable lies that let people sleep soundly while children suffered in silence. The law, the church, and even the community itself had worked together to build a wall of willful ignorance that looked like it couldn't be broken. But as she walked home through the darkening sky, Thomas's tear-stained face followed her. There was no one else for those boys. If she gave up now, they would be stuck in that horrible house until Abigail's sick games killed them all. It wasn't a matter of whether she could win against such strong opposition. It was a matter of whether she could live with herself if she didn't try. It was a cold November morning when Eliza couldn't take it anymore and confronted the other person. She had spent sleepless nights walking around her cabin, hearing Thomas's broken confession in her head, while the community kept treating Abigail Stroud like a holy saint. Every Sunday, when Abigail sat in the front pew with her hands folded over her growing belly, it felt like a mockery of everything good and holy. Eliza knew that waiting for the right people to do their jobs and hoping for slow change would only give that monster more time to completely destroy those boys' souls. She saw Silas Stroud chopping wood behind his barn. He was moving clumsily and unsteadily from the bottle he had probably opened before breakfast. The man who had once been a respected landowner and devoted father now looked like a scarecrow. His eyes were empty, he hadn't shaved, and his clothes hung loosely on a frame that whiskey had whittled down to bone and sinew. "Silas," Eliza yelled, and her voice cut through the morning air like an axe. "We need to talk. Your wife is hurting your sons." The words hit him like a punch in the gut, and he almost dropped his axe. For a moment, something that looked like clarity flashed in his bloodshot eyes. "What the hell are you talking about?" "Abigail is. Abigail is hurting those boys, Silas. She's been making them sleep with her for years, and that baby she's carrying isn't yours. It's theirs. It was made through violence and manipulation that would make the devil cry." Silas looked at her like a man who had just been hit by lightning, his face twisted with anger and denial as her words sank in. "You're crazy, woman! My wife is a saint! She saved this family when we were drowning in grief!" "Silas, look at your sons. Really look at them. See how they flinch when she touches them, and how they've grown quiet and empty? Thomas told me everything, how it started when he was 13, how she threatens them with exposure if they resist, and how she's convinced them they're complicit in their own violation. Thomas is a lying little bastard if he said that. Silas's voice rose to a roar, but Eliza could hear the fear of a man whose worst fears were coming true. Abigail has been nothing but good to this family. She cooks, cleans, and takes care of us when we're sick. What kind of ungrateful monster would make up such filthy lies about a woman who— Silas Stroud, what in the Lord's name is all this noise about? The voice was sweet and worried, and it made Eliza's blood run cold. Abigail came around the corner of the barn like an angel, her golden hair shining in the morning sun and her pregnant belly showing through her neat blue dress. Caleb was behind her, his jaw clenched and fists tight at his sides. Thomas was pale as death and shaking. This woman, Silas stammered, sounding unsure all of a sudden. She's saying terrible things about you, dear. Horrible things that I won't even say. Abigail's blue eyes got bigger, and it looked like she was really shocked and hurt. Accusations against me? She put her delicate hand over her heart, looking like a hurt child. Eliza, dear, what could I have done to make you hate me? You know exactly what you've done, Eliza said, her voice steady even though she was getting angrier by the second. And these boys know too. Thomas, tell your father what she's been doing to you. Thomas opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His eyes moved back and forth between his stepmother and father like an animal that was trapped and wanted to get away. Caleb moved closer to his younger brother to protect him, but his own face showed that he had given up hope. Oh, my sweet children, Abigail cooed as she moved to put her hands on the boys' shoulders. They got tense when she touched them, but they didn't pull away. Is this what this is about? Have you been telling Miss Gable's stories? You know how your imaginations can get out of control. Those aren't stories, Eliza said in a panic. Silas, look at them. Look at how they react when she touches them. No child should be afraid of their mother like that. But Abigail was already weaving her web with great skill. Her eyes were full of tears that sparkled in the morning light. Oh, Eliza, I get it now. You see how lucky I am to have a loving husband, beautiful children, and another baby on the way. It hurts you. How could it not? A woman alone, childless, watching life go by while others enjoy family life. This has nothing to do with, but to make up such horrible stories and such horrible accusations. Abigail's voice broke, and it sounded like she was really heartbroken. To try to poison a family's love with your own bitterness. Oh dear, I feel sorry for you more than I blame you. Eliza felt the ground move under her feet as she saw Silas's face change. He was no longer confused and scared. Instead, he was becoming angry at his wife and suspicious of her accuser. There's something else, Abigail said, lowering her voice to a whisper, as if she were telling a secret. Something that explains why Miss Gable might be so fixated on such dark possibilities. Tell me, Eliza, do you ever think about little Mary Henderson? Do you ever wonder what might have happened if you'd spoken up 20 years ago when you saw her uncle visiting her room at night? Eliza felt like she had been punched in the chest when she heard the words. They took the air out of her lungs and made the world spin around her. Mary Henderson, sweet, quiet Mary, who was found hanging from a beam in her family's barn when she was only 16 years old. Mary, whose desperate eyes had looked for Eliza's help that awful summer, and whose whispered pleas for help Eliza had dismissed as childish imagination. Yes, I know all about that, Abigail said with silk and cruelty. People in small towns have long memories, and they talk. You had a chance to save a child once before, didn't you? But you chose to mind your own business instead. You chose silence over action, and a young girl paid the ultimate price for your cowardice. Now you're trying to atone for that sin by making a crisis where none exists and ruining an innocent family to ease your guilty conscience. The horrible, unavoidable truth hit Eliza like a wave of cold water. She had let Mary Henderson down on purpose and out of moral cowardice, just like Abigail said. She had chosen the easy path of not getting involved instead of the hard path of getting involved, and a child had died because she didn't speak up. Abigail's accusation was true in every way, and everyone in the room could see the guilt on her face. Abigail said softly, "You see how she doesn't deny it?" She wrapped her arms around her husband's waist. in a gesture of perfect wifely support. This poor, tormented woman has been carrying that burden for decades, and now she's projecting her own demons onto our family. I forgive you, Eliza, but I cannot allow you to continue spreading these poisonous lies about innocent children who have already suffered enough loss in their young lives. Silas's eyes turned to disgust and contempt as he looked at Eliza. Get off my land! Get off and don't come back! If I hear you've been telling lies about my wife and family, there will be consequences. Eliza felt like her soul had been ripped open and left raw to the mountain wind when she walked away from that barn. Abigail's counterattack wasn't cruel. It was very precise. Every word was true. Eliza had let Mary Henderson down because she was afraid and couldn't make a moral decision. That failure had haunted her for 20 years. Abigail's revelation of this terrible secret not only ruined Eliza's credibility, but it also showed the deeper psychological reasons behind her crusade. The story spread through the mountain community like wildfire in just a few hours. It wasn't the story of abuse and horror that Eliza had tried to tell. It was the story of a bitter, childless woman who was so consumed by guilt from long ago that she made up terrible lies about an innocent family. The community's response was quick and harsh. The doors that had always been open to her slammed shut. Women who had been getting her herbal medicines for years suddenly found other places to get the medical care they needed. The minister, who had always been polite to her, even started crossing the street to avoid her. By winter's end, Eliza Gable had become a pariah in her own community, her life's work in ruins, her reputation destroyed by the very truth she'd tried to expose. As snow piled up against the windows of her cabin, she sat alone, knowing that 2 boys were still going through hell somewhere across the valley, while their tormentor enjoyed the community's sympathy. The weight of her 2 failures, one in the past and one in the present, was about to break her spirit. And for the first time in her life, she understood why Mary Henderson had chosen the rope over another day of unbearable existence. The change didn't happen all at once. It came on slowly and steadily, like dawn breaking through the dark of winter. For 3 months, she had been stuck in the ashes of her reputation, unable to move because the community had turned against her, and she felt guilty about Mary Henderson. She had seen the seasons change from her cabin windows. She had seen Abigail's belly grow bigger every week, and the boys get thinner and more hollow-eyed when she saw them in town. But deep down in her sadness, a coal of determination started to glow. It wasn't the hot flame of righteous anger that had fueled her first crusade. It was something deeper and more lasting. She knew that her goal was no longer to convince a community that was willfully blind or save her own bad reputation. It was about telling the truth for the sake of the truth, and making sure that what was happening to those boys didn't get lost in the quiet that small towns used to hide their secrets. She started to write. Every morning before dawn, she sat at her kitchen table with a pen and paper and wrote down everything she knew in an orderly way. Thomas's confession by the creek, which she wrote down word for word as she remembered it. What she saw during that awful trip to the Stroud cabin. The boys' fear. Abigail's cold, calculating nature, and Silas's stubborn refusal to see. Martha's first story about what she saw through the cabin's broken wall. The dates, the specifics, and the little things that showed a pattern of abuse. She wrote with the accuracy of a court clerk and the anger of an avenging angel, making a record that couldn't be dismissed as hysteria or a lie. The work turned into a kind of prayer, a way to honor the pain that everyone else chose to ignore. Each carefully written sentence was a way to fight back against the conspiracy of silence that kept monsters safe and killed children. She also wrote about Mary Henderson, facing that old failure with brutal honesty and writing about how she was involved in a different tragedy, while making it clear how cowardice in the past and bravery in the present are different. On a gray March morning, when the first tentative buds were starting to show on the mountain maples, someone knocked on the door. When Eliza opened her door, she saw Martha Pringle on her porch. Martha looked older and more worn out than she had just a few months before. The woman who used to use gossip as a weapon now seemed smaller, her sharp edges dulled by guilt and being alone. "Can I come in?" Martha asked softly. Her usual commanding presence turned into a polite request. They were in Eliza's kitchen, and the silence between them was like a chasm. Finally, Martha spoke in a voice that was barely audible. I've been a coward, Eliza. A selfish, cowardly woman who cared more about her own reputation than about those poor boys. What's done is done, Martha. No, it's not done. Not while those kids are still in pain. Martha took a bundle wrapped in brown cloth out of her coat. I found this 3 days ago, stuck in a bramble bush near the Stroud barn. I was walking the property line looking for my hen that had gotten loose, and there it was. Eliza's hands shook as she unwrapped the cloth, and she felt her blood turn to ice. There was a piece of fabric inside that was torn, stained with what looked like blood, and small enough to belong to a child. It was rough homespun cotton that mountain families used to make clothes for everyday use. The way it was torn suggested that it had been ripped off during a fight. It's from a boy's shirt, Martha said, her voice full of emotion. I know, because I helped Sarah Miller make shirts like this for her sons last summer. Same pattern, same weave. And those stains, they're not from an accident or honest work. They're from violence, Eliza, from someone being hurt badly. The physical evidence felt like a gift from God, real proof that backed up all the terrible testimonies and observations that had been written off as female hysteria and bitter imagination. This was something that couldn't be explained away or made to seem innocent. Why are you telling me this now? Eliza asked. Because I've seen what happened to you over the past few months and what's happening to those boys. Caleb came to town last week to get supplies, and I swear he looked like a ghost. Hollow, distant, like something inside him had died. And Thomas. I haven't seen Thomas since Christmas. Word is he's been sick and staying close to home. Martha's voice broke. I know what sickly means for that house. Martha, the community won't listen to us. They made their choice. Maybe not just to us, but what if we made them listen? What if we made it so they couldn't look away? Martha leaned forward, her eyes shining with desperate hope. Sunday service. Everyone in town was there, and there was no way to escape the truth. The plan they came up with was simple and scary. Eliza would go to church on Sunday for the first time since her public shame, bringing with her her carefully written testimony and Martha's damning proof. When the time was right, she would stand up and tell the truth in front of everyone in the community. The air was clear and cold on Sunday morning, and the mountains were so clear that every sound could be heard for miles. Eliza took her time getting ready, picking out her best dress and pinning her gray hair back with the ivory combs her mother had left her. She looked like what she was, a 6'2" mountain woman who had been through a lot but had not let it get her down. When she walked into the church, everyone stopped talking and turned to stare at the outcast who had the nerve to show her face in God's house. She calmly walked to an empty pew near the back, ignoring the whispers and angry looks. She had her written testimony and Martha's terrible evidence folded up in her reticule. Abigail Stroud sat in the front row with her family. Her pregnancy was now so obvious that even the loosest dress couldn't hide it. She looked like a saint who was in pain, pale, ethereal, and with her hands folded protectively over her swollen belly. Silas was sitting next to her, sober for once because it was the Lord's Day, and the two boys were there too. Eliza could see the stiff tension in their young bodies, even from the back of the church. They sat with military precision, as if they were afraid that any relaxed movement would draw unwanted attention. Reverend Morrison started his sermon with a passage about how important it is to protect the innocent from people who would hurt them and how sacred family is. Eliza was so full of irony that it almost choked her. But she waited. She had learned patience in her months of isolation, and she knew that truth delivered at the right moment carried more power than any number of desperate interruptions. Eliza stood up when the Reverend reached his peak about Christian duty and moral courage. The movement made the congregation gasp in shock, and Reverend Morrison stopped in the middle of his sentence. He said carefully, "Sister Gable, do you have something to say?" "I do, Reverend. I have a testimony to give," she said clearly through the wooden church, her heart pounding but her voice calm and steady. "About how we all have a duty to speak up for those who can't speak for themselves and protect the innocent." She started to read from her carefully prepared document, and her words cut through the morning air like judgment itself. She talked about Thomas's broken confession, what she saw during that awful visit, and the abuse that had been going on behind closed doors and was protected by willful blindness. The people in the church were frozen in place. Some looked shocked, some looked like they couldn't believe what they were hearing, and some looked like they were starting to realize things they had chosen to ignore. "That's enough, Sister Gable," Reverend Morrison yelled. But Eliza's voice was louder than his. "And if you doubt these words," she went on, pulling something out of her reticule, "if you think that a woman my age would make up such terrible things for her own sick reasons, then explain this." The congregation gasped as she held up the torn, blood-stained piece of shirt. "Found 3 days ago near the Stroud barn. Ripped off the body of a young person who had been hurt and bled." The silence that came after was complete and damning. At that moment, the wall of willful ignorance that had kept Abigail Stroud safe for so long finally started to break down. The firestorm that followed Eliza's church testimony spread through the Stroud family like fire through dry wood. Within hours of the service, the blood-stained shirt piece had been passed around dozens of people, each of whom looked at it with the horrified curiosity of someone who was faced with proof of something they really wanted to believe was impossible. The whispered conversations that had once protected Abigail's reputation now turned against her with equal ferocity, as neighbors remembered small details they'd previously dismissed. The boy's increasing withdrawal, the strange sounds Martha claimed to have heard, the way Thomas had grown pale and skeletal over the winter months. Sheriff Brody finally agreed to go to the Stroud homestead, after powerful families who could no longer act like they didn't know what was going on put more and more pressure on him. But his investigation was only half-hearted. He only talked to Silas for a short time, asked the boys a few questions in front of Abigail, and looked around the property quickly. There were no formal charges or arrests. Eliza had learned the hard way that the law was still a tool for convenience, not for justice. But the court of public opinion was much more important than any legal case. The community's rejection of Abigail was as quick and complete as their previous love for her. Women who used to ask her for spiritual advice now crossed the street to stay away from her. The church ladies group quietly took her off of all of her committees. Even the merchant families who relied on the Stroud's business started to treat them with a cold formality that spoke louder than any public condemnation. Silas finally saw his wife clearly after the weight of the evidence and the judgment of his peers took away his protective fantasies. The fight that followed broke down the last lies that kept their toxic home together. Neighbors said that there were fights that went on for hours, with Silas yelling about being tricked by a devil that looked like an angel and the sound of furniture breaking. Whatever hold Abigail had on him through lies and manipulation fell apart when the truth came out. The end didn't come with a big fight. Instead, it came with the quiet end that happens when lies can't hold up anymore. Abigail, whose pregnancy was getting worse and whose reputation was in ruins, went to her sister's house in a faraway county, saying that the mountain air was no longer good for her fragile state. She only left behind whispered promises to come back after the baby was born, promises that everyone knew she would never keep. Silas, who was heartbroken and ashamed, sold his house for much less than it was worth and disappeared into the crowds of Charleston, taking only a wagon full of things and a lifetime of regret with him. Silas's brother Marcus, a strict but good man who farmed tobacco in the river valley 30 miles south, saved the boys. Marcus had heard the rumors and seen enough families fall apart to know when kids needed to be saved from the mess that adults had made. On a cool April morning, he drove to the empty Stroud homestead with a wagon and a quiet determination to put together what was left of his nephew's broken family. Caleb and Thomas packed their few things quickly and without thinking, like survivors who had learned not to expect safety or permanence. They moved through their childhood home like ghosts, not touching anything that wasn't necessary, as if the walls were full of memories that were too painful to remember. Caleb did one last thing before he left the mountain for good. He showed up at Eliza's cabin just after sunset. His 7-year-old body was still thin and weak from what he had been through, but he was starting to believe in his own future. He stood on her porch for a long time, trying to find the right words to describe how big the gap was between them. "Miss Gable," he finally said. His voice was still broken from years of hiding his fear, but it had a new quality to it, as if it were the start of peace. "I came to say thank you." Eliza looked at this young man who had been through hell and still had the strength to find her. Her heart broke and healed at the same time. "Don't thank me, son. I let you down for too long." "No, ma'am. You didn't fail us. You saved us." He took a small object out of his pocket that had been carved from mountain birch. A bird in flight, with its wings spread wide, and every feather detailed with the care of someone who had needed to believe that escape was possible. "I made this during the long nights, when I thought no one would ever believe us, and that we would never be free. I want you to have it." The wooden bird was warm from being in his pocket, and smooth from being handled. It was a sign of hope that stayed alive, even in the worst of times. Eliza wrapped her fingers around it and felt the weight of everything it stood for. Suffering recognized, truth spoken, and silence finally broken. "Caleb, take care of yourself and your brother. You both have whole lives ahead of you now." "Yes, ma'am. We know that now, thanks to you." He walked away into the dark, leaving Eliza alone on her porch with the carved bird in her hand. She watched until his lantern disappeared down the mountain path, taking him to whatever healing might be possible for young souls that had been hurt but not killed. Over the next few months, the community's treatment of Eliza slowly got better, but the scars of the conflict were still visible under the surface politeness. Some families went back to her for herbal remedies because they knew her knowledge was too valuable to waste on being moral. Others stayed away because they didn't want to be reminded of how they had helped the boys suffer. Truth had split the town in ways that lies had never been able to, leaving cracks that would never fully heal. Eliza also changed in ways that were both big and small because of the experience. Her hair had turned completely white during the ordeal, and the lines around her eyes had gotten deeper from the stress of standing alone against a community's willful blindness. But there was also a new quality to her demeanor, a quiet strength that came from having seen the worst of people and not turning away. Eliza stood on her porch and held up the carved bird to catch the last light of day as the mountains turned gold and red in the fall. The people in her community were still imperfect and still tended to choose easy lies over hard truths. She hadn't changed human nature or gotten rid of evil from the world. Perfect justice was still as hard to find as it had always been in a world where power protected itself and victims suffered in silence. But she had done something that might have been even more important. She had refused to let horror hide behind respectability, given voice to those who had none, and made sure that 2 young lives would not be lost to keep the peace in the community. The truth had come in and broken the silence that had once kept monsters safe. It was uncomfortable, but necessary. Eliza turned the wooden bird over in her worn hands and let herself feel a mix of happiness and sadness as the sun went down and the first stars came out above the ridgeline. She had paid a high price for her moral courage, losing friends and her reputation in the name of principles that asked for everything and promised nothing. But down in the valley, 2 boys were sleeping soundly for the first time in years. They were free to start the long road to recovery. It had been worth it for them, and for the memory of Mary Henderson, whose silence she had finally broken.